All right, so we are talking about public opinion today. That seems to be working. So let's go to this. Oh, you know what? I lied. Give me 1 second. I didn't finish. This is where we left off. So I don't want to skip over anything. The lecture should be live, right? If the audio is not working or something like that, then we'll get to that point in a second. Let me make sure I'm getting the... Okay. So we actually talked about Latinos or Latinx individuals last class, right? If you look at the quiz, right, there's a question, right? Immigration is a bigger issue for Latinx individuals or Hispanic individuals, in part because, right, one, there are more people who were invited to come to the United States but not remain as citizens. That's what we call a migrant worker. But also, right, there is just a geographical difference, right? The closest countries are going to have the most immigration. And while we do have immigration from Canada, sort of back, people coming from Canada, right? We'll talk about that later when we talk about race and ethnicity, why Canadians aren't being treated the same as sort of Southern people coming from the South to the United States. We talked about Asian Americans. I believe we talked about Asian Americans. So, right, the only group that was legally excluded from citizenship until United States v. Wong Kim Ark, right, where you have eventually, right, becomes very clear that citizenship should be at birth, right? That's something that's sort of being challenged a little bit here and there. But it has always been the basis of the United States that if you were born here, you were an American. But these laws have excluded specific groups. And then in World War II, obviously, Japanese internment camps, right? Their property was seized. They were forced to live in internment camps. Most of this you should have covered in sort of high school history courses. But if not, there are some new videos, like some new documentaries, right? There's all these docuseries coming out right now that really cover some of these issues, especially Chinese exclusion and internment camps, right? Very, very good documentaries that could probably explain much better than I would. All right. So the thing, we talk about Native Americans, it's the same for what we use this language as indigenous people. So you can be indigenous. Camera's not right spot. Part of the history of Native Americans or the indigenous people of the United States is that they start out, right, as very conflictual. We know we had the Trail of Tears, right, sort of a genocide committed upon them. So then after a period of time, around the 1860s to 1920s, they're isolated to small reservations, right? They're sort of placed in they're said, this is the land you can live on. But we know that if you just allowed certain areas to live on, they might not live there. They might integrate into society, and some of them do. Some of them do integrate into society. The problem is until the 1920s, right, they weren't allowed to become citizens, which means they couldn't work in some activities. They couldn't go to school, right? We'll talk about this. I think we're talking about this later when we're talking about education, right? Universities pop up after the 1940s because after World War II, you have all these veterans coming back with the GI Bill. But even before that, you had a lot of schools, and you did have some funding that they could get, right, to go to school, right, especially at college education, but they had to be citizens to do it, right? So Native Americans are excluded until 1924 from a lot of access to public education, right, including K through 12 schools and access to colleges, right? And they're sort of isolated from any other aspects, right? No government services because they're not citizens, right? And so the deal originally, right, sort of the colonial settlers of the United States, what they originally thought of is you can govern yourself, but you're not going to be part of the United States. What we have today is eventually start seeing a lot of local self-government, and then you have some sort of recognition that they can be both, right? Now you can be an American citizen and be recognized as a Native American. And when you're recognized, right, that's why we have tribal numbers, right? You have to enroll in a tribal number. You can have certain self-governance. You can now have benefits, right? Because the government is trying to fix this gap between Native American education and the rest of the population. So you have a switch where now we started to see in the 1950s and 1960s sort of try to bridge that gap between, right, Native Americans who had been historically disadvantaged, right, and excuse me, and right, the population that had been citizens beforehand. We now see, right, one of the ways that a lot of tribes and reservations are now funding themselves, right, is through gambling, right? So this creates an issue, right? If you have ever been to California, right, you will notice that there are a lot of casinos, right, and that's how they're legal, right? Local self-governance means it might be illegal in the state of California, but why Native tribes are in California, they have their own governing rules, and that California law may not apply to them. And this became a balancing act that this was a way for them to raise revenue. There's a lot of research about whether or not there's actual revenue sharing, but some of the earlier casinos that were built in the 90s and the early 2000s were very successful at building their own school systems and their own infrastructure, right? And getting them out of poverty, maybe not giving them everything, but getting them out of poverty. Disabled Americans until 1990 were allowed to be legally excluded from jobs and restaurants, right? So the Americans with Disabilities Act tried to do two things, and it really shook up the way that businesses work in the United States. The first is to end discrimination. You can't throw someone who is in a wheelchair out of your business, right? You want to end discrimination. You can't not hire someone because they have a disability, right? This is in part in the 1990s to get them to work, right? To get them to go to not just that they need to be working, but they should have access to work. And if they are working, right, then they can provide for themselves, right? And then it's less government resources going to that individual. That is one part of it, right? You want them to be able to go to work. And that really fits with our equality of opportunity argument that we had earlier in the semester, right? Everyone should be able to use their talents to go after what they want. And if there's discrimination, right, the government should step in and stop that discrimination. So that was the first part. This had a little bit of pushback, but not really that bad, right? You might have to hire someone who's maybe not your first choice, right, but is still very qualified to do that job. And, right, because we know now that disabled individuals stick with their jobs much longer, right? Part of that's that their insurance is tied to where they work, so they can't really afford to quit, right, when they typically have higher medical costs, but they're more loyal employees. So now companies who are doing more technical stuff, they want physically disabled individuals because you get a tax break, right? They're going to stay there longer, right? They're going to communicate with you better about what they need and what they can do, right? So now that's a shift there. The other part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, is that you have to provide access points, right? And this became a big deal. In the 1980s, no business had a ramp. They just did not have ramps. And so when the ADA passes, it's a federal change where all businesses have to provide ramps and access points to people in wheelchairs. Now, this is the part that really starts getting businesses and sort of conservatives against this ADA, because you have to pull away some of your curb and some of your parking to provide services, right? You have to provide handicap spots, you have to provide, right, ramps to get into your business. You have to make sure there's multiple entrances and exits that are able for people to get in and out, right? And it costs money, right? And anytime you ask a business to absorb a cost that's being mandated by the government, you're gonna have pushback by fiscal conservatives, right? Why am I being forced to do that? Now, you have this process, right? But because the act comes in and there's no challenge to it, right? There's not really a legal challenge to it, right? What you have is people wanting to change that law, right? And we'll see, right, when we talk more about public opinion, right? People want to convince the public, right? All of you, right? And your friends, right? And all this, people not involved in government, they want to convince you that what something is doing is either wrong or unconstitutional or should be changed, right? So instead of talking about just can the courts make a difference or can we pass laws, when we get into the next chapter, right, disabled Americans fit into this weird view where they're considered as deserving, right? They deserve to have these benefits, right? Whereas minorities, especially racial minorities, are often seen as undeserving, right? The public opinion is that disabled individuals deserve benefits, right? They're the deserving poor is the language that we would use. Then the next group is gay men and lesbians, right? In the law, sometimes when they talk about someone being gay, right, they're referring to a male, and then lesbians are separate. But also, if we look historically, there's this sort of erasure of females, that lesbians just don't exist in our society, right? The same way that Russians did, maybe up until the last 5 to 10 years, where they're just like, oh, there are no gay Russians, right? That this idea that they just don't exist and sort of ignoring them. So a lot of the laws really come into play about gay men, right? Because that, I think, to some groups of society is much more offensive, right? This idea of men being gay is much more offensive to them. So for a long time, right, you have, right, the same-sex partners can't get married. Individuals who are attracted to same-sex partners cannot join the military, right? If you were gay and it's found out that you're gay, not only will you be kicked out of the military, but you will be dishonorably discharged, right? And you'll probably be punished with some sort of criminal penalty, right? And we won't really get into that, right? But the laws are set up in such a way that all gay and lesbian acts are considered criminal, right? In most states, right, and in the government, in the federal government, and in the military, right, any act that would be considered gay or lesbian is criminalized in the language such a way that it doesn't seem discriminatory, but is very clearly discriminatory in practice. So in 1993, right, Clinton and the liberals, right, they decide that they want people to be able to serve in the military, that everyone should be able to serve in the military, right? And remember, while trans individuals have always existed, right, we've always had trans individuals, they're not really acknowledged by the public until about the early 2000s, right? But yes, there are trans individuals in the world, right? There's a war hero from World War I and World War II that is trans, right? But they're sort of so obscure and they're a small enough number that the public's not really recognizing them yet. So it's really just about gay men and lesbians, right? And in 1993, he says, well, I want everyone to be able to serve, but he can't just say you can serve no matter who you are. So the Democrats come up with a compromise that they call Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And now it's I don't know, I mean, Pete Buttigieg, he talked about it a little bit, but now it's sort of historical. You don't really think about it as much, right? That you would never have to deal with that. So the way that Don't Ask, Don't Tell worked is I couldn't, as I was in the Army, right? I couldn't ask my other service members, or if I was a sergeant, I couldn't ask my junior enlisted, or when I was recruiting them, I could not ask them if they were gay, right? You couldn't ask, right? I couldn't ask them about their personal life. I couldn't ask them about any part of their life that was romantic. That just was not what you did, right? But if I saw a soldier in a homosexual act, then I would report it, and that individual would be kicked out under the same rules that existed before. So while it was considered a good first step, you can see immediately the problem, right? You're allowed to serve in the military, but you have to hide your personal life, right? To hide your personal life. And then what we found, right, is I'm going to use a small example from my life, right, that really quickly. What we found, right, is I was in the Army. I had a friend who was in the Army. I was a linguist in the Army. Our skill set was very useful. That linguist was very good at his job, right? He was very qualified, and he was a friend of mine, and we would go to a bar, we would go hang out, right? We would go do things. And sometimes a sergeant would show up, right? A sergeant in our unit would show up. And that sergeant was trying to catch that individual in a gay act, right? Outside of our work hours, that sergeant was so offended that he would have to serve with a gay person that he followed us to places to see if he would do something like kiss another man, right? Because then he could document it and he could kick him out of the military because he was so offended, right? In part because for anyone, right, that some people are very obviously different, right? That sergeant knew, but he couldn't prove. Now, here's the problem is what that sergeant was doing was morally wrong. But in his mind and under the letter of the law, he was trying to see if that person was doing something, right? And don't ask, don't tell, right? If he's seen publicly kissing someone else and he is a service member, right, then he has committed something, he had done something wrong against the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So in 2011, right, Obama's in office. He says he evolves on same-sex marriage, right? So he goes from civil unions to same-sex marriage. And then he ends Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and he says you can openly serve, right, if you are gay or lesbian in the military, because it shouldn't matter, right? And there's a lot of backlash for this, right? There's a lot of backlash in 2011 that he's doing this, because there's still a lot of argument that gay men should not be serving in the military and women shouldn't be serving, all women shouldn't be serving in the military, right? You have this conservative viewpoint. So that's right, that's a personal experience I have. You can see that it's problematic. You're trying to take a first step, right? And when we talk about the Affordable Care Act, we'll talk about how that's a first step that's very problematic as well, right? These middle solutions are normal for government, right? You're trying to find the middle solution, the compromise, but it's going to come with some trade-offs. The Defense of Marriage Act passes in 1993. So Clinton is president. He uses an executive order to go to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Meanwhile, Congress, who Clinton doesn't have the power. There are enough votes that his veto wouldn't matter. And in 1993, Republicans passed the Defense of Marriage Act. And the Defense of Marriage Act is a federal law that says marriage is between one man and one woman, right? Now, in part, right, it's argued that it's to stop polygamy in Utah, right? That not to pick on Utah, right, but right, Mormons are the only American religion that practices polygamy, right, which is where you have multiple wives for one man, right? So they sort of use that, but they also are making it very clear that they're taking a stance against sort of this liberal push to accept gay and lesbian people into society, right? So you have this push and this act passes, right? And it says that marriage is just one man, one woman. What that does, right, because of the supremacy clause of the federal government, that means all of the states that had been previously allowing same-sex marriage, their licenses were no longer valid, right? Remember, you have this full faith and privilege clause, right, in the Constitution. So if I get married in Virginia and I go to Texas where it's not legal, they still have to respect my marriage license because of that part of the Constitution that says my license from another state has to be valid in every other state, right? Your driver's license has to be valid. Your marriage license has to be valid in all of the states if it's given to you by one state. So this Defense of Marriage Act uses the supremacy clause to sort of keep same-sex marriage from going to more and more states. Now, states don't listen to the federal government, right? It should be very clear to you now, right? When you look at the behavior of states, they don't listen, right? They're trying actively not to listen, right? Nevada does not follow the guidance of the federal government. It doesn't want to, right? And it has that 10th Amendment protection. So you have all of these fights, right? Eventually in Obergefell v. Hodges and other court cases, right? The same-sex marriage bans on same-sex marriage is found to be unconstitutional. So that's resolved, right? In 2011, open service in the military is allowed. Now our fight in the military is about trans individuals, right? Should they be allowed to in the military? Should they be allowed to serve in combat roles, right? There's a lot of fights about this. And you aren't just going to get, sometimes we like to just boil this down to bigotry and sort of acceptance. But there are a lot of other factors that people are going to bring up that may have some merit, right? I can't speak to that, right? Because my opinions are irrelevant, right? But if you look at the merits of the argument, some of them have merits, right? In a combat unit, right, sometimes you can argue that cohesiveness matters. And if you look at the military today, you will see very homogenous units, right? That I was in Texas at Fort Hood, right? 1st Cav and 4th ID, they have very different racial and ethnic makeups, right? That if you are white and rural, you're probably going to go to one unit, and if you're black and urban, you're probably going to another unit. So there's already some segregation that exists de facto, right, where they talk about unit cohesion. But the validity of that requires more research. So if you're interested in that, right, there's unit cohesion research that you can look into. In 2009 is actually the first time that hate crimes are, the definition of hate crimes includes gay and transgendered people, right? It's not until 2009. So there have always been laws against sort of attacking another individual. But the reason why 2009 sort of marks a shift is until 2009, and even today, there are a lot of states that have what's called a gay surprise law. And so a gay surprise law is defined in such a way that if I am out with a friend, someone who I think is a friend, and they are another male, and then that person tries to transition from a platonic relationship to an intimate relationship, right? Say they lean in for a kiss or something, I can visit physical harm on them. Gay surprise is that I can feel threatened by their sexuality enough that if I murder them, that I can still use that as a legal defense and say I was defending myself, that it was self-defense, right, in that act, right? So gay surprise laws are very complicated, right? Obviously, you know, I'm showing a little bit of bias there because they exist in such a way that if you were a trans person and then you're intimate with you're with your partner and you become intimate and they think you are cisgendered and you're actually transgendered, right? They can visit harm upon you in defense of themselves, right? That's legal, right? So when we're talking about things like that, the normative aspects aside, right? However you feel about it normatively, the law allows self-defense when you find out who that person's identity is, right? For a lot of them, it's an identity. So when we're talking about something like that, obviously that group is very concerned about different things, right? If you look at the list of things, and why am I stopping here for a little longer than maybe I have plenty of time? So why am I stopping here? Because it's very clear that their needs, right? They want protection against harm, right? A Latinx community wants immigration reform, right? If you're an Asian community, you're worried about discrimination in certain aspects, but not worried about immigration or physical harm as much, right? Your priorities are different based on what group you come from. And because we have discriminated differently for certain minority groups, their desires and their preferences are going to be very different. So when we're talking about this, right, sometimes we like to, in the past, not just students, but also educators have liked to say, oh, let's just treat everyone equally. Well, it's going to be very problematic, right? We know when we look at statistics that Asian Americans require a lot less resources. They require less resources than other minority groups. But in part, that's because they were isolated for so long, right? They weren't allowed to live in certain places. They weren't allowed to have citizenship. They weren't allowed to do certain things. And so they weren't able to sort of engage in the community, right? A lot of rhetoric about sort of minorities taking up resources, but we know, right, the majority of the population was, until about 5 years ago, white. So the majority of the resources that the government was providing was to white individuals. And now we know that the ratio, right, a white individual is much more likely to get government resources than any of these other groups, including disabled Americans, right? So the data that we have shifts the rhetoric we're using. And because the rhetoric is being used, or this identity is being used to treat people differently, each group has to be recognized as different so that we can understand what laws are being practiced and maybe what remedies should be introduced, right? When we talk about government, one of the things that people miss is everyone wants to find a solution to a problem, right? But if you don't understand that problem, it's going to be much harder to find a proper solution, right? Why do so many policies in the United States do so poorly? Because they fail to recognize the actual problem. Okay, I think that was the last slide. Okay. Affirmative action is something that comes up in the 20th century. It doesn't really happen as much, but we talked about this a little bit, and then we'll jump to the other one. Affirmative action is that I need to recognize past injustices. So we talked about this, right? You're a minority group, you've been discriminated against. Affirmative action is trying to balance that out. So what we see, right, and this happens a lot in schools because it's the most obvious, because you have a clear rejection acceptance, right? UNLV is not a high rejection. I mean, I don't know if you could, I mean, I'm sure people get rejected, but for most of you, you should have been able to get into this with your, even if you didn't have a great GPA, or like, right, UNLV is not the type of university that has a high rejection. I mean, you might feel differently about it, or I don't know. I don't actually know because I didn't get any undergraduate degrees here, right? I came from Sacramento. But universities at the higher level, right, and we're top tier now, but we weren't when I first got here, right? And right, that the actual college population is quite small here, so you don't have to reject a lot of people because there aren't as many people coming in yet. I'm sure it'll get more difficult to come to UNLV later in the next few years. But I'm going to look at you, and I'm going to look at each individual case, and affirmative action says, okay, I have this very wealthy white student whose parents are both doctors. And then I have this very, very poor minority student, depending on what type of minority they are, and one of their parents is in jail, right? And so that would be a holistic approach, right? And I would say, okay, they both have a 4.0 GPA, they both have good extracurriculars. Well, I'm going to take the minority, because the minority has shown that they, right, the argument is that they have been disadvantaged. So if they're equal to a white student, that means they overcame more to get to that same point, right? So that's affirmative action, right? If there's a tie, I'm going to give the tie, right? We're going to use that sort of sports language, right? I'm going to give it to the minority because of past injustices that may have made it more difficult. Now, the problem comes in legally is if I just say, all right, if I'm on a 100-point scale and I say all minorities get 5 extra points, right? And that's how I'm going to judge who gets in and who doesn't get in. That's unconstitutional. That's clear discrimination, right? We want to make sure that we're not discriminating another way. Affirmative action, right, would argue what you need to do is you need to look at that person holistically and say, because they're a minority, were they disadvantaged? Or can we reasonably assume that they were disadvantaged and maybe adjust their score a little? And what colleges came up with was sort of a difficulty of life gradient, right? How difficult was your life before you got here? And what they can argue, right? Sometimes they say we have to have like, not just, am I trying to help minorities, but is there a reason for it? We argue and we know that minorities do better in school because they have had more hardships to get here. The harder your life was until you got here, and then if we put you in a dorm and we just have you go into school and you had a very hard life beforehand, then school will be very easy for you, right? Basic training was very, very easy for me. I came from a food insecure home, right? I didn't have 3 meals a day. I shared a 1-bedroom with my mom and my brother. We were very, very poor. I was escaping poverty. So when someone said do push-ups, I was happy to do push-ups because then afterwards I got French toast, right? So when you have someone who comes from that level of poverty, when you have someone that comes from that struggle, we know they're going to do better, right? And so that's how affirmative action works now, is I can recognize the difficulty you faced, and I know that you're going to be more prepared for difficulty in the future, and that's going to make you a better candidate than someone who had an easier life, who may not be ready, right? That's why we see a lot of burnouts in Ivy Leagues, right? They had an easy life, they have a support network, and then they get to a point where they're not the top of the class, where they're sort of average in an Ivy League, right? And then because they're not used to struggle, they will fall, right? Whereas most of you, right, you're at UNLV, right, depending on who your families are, right, some of you have struggled so much to get here that this first few years of your university will seem like a cakewalk, right? Maybe not compared to the education you had with CCSD, but we'll get into CCSD later. All right. So now we're going to go from the end of chapter 5 into chapter 6. We're going to be talking about public opinion. I didn't see any questions. Remember, I am checking the live feed, and then, right, for those of you in the room, right, if you have a question, feel free to stop me. I do add a few anecdotes here and there, but I also speak very quickly, so you will never offend me if something was unclear, right? And then if you have a question that's more specific, right, I will try to answer it, right? I've been doing this for a while now, so if there is a specific question, don't feel like you can't ask it. And also, you can also email me in class. I don't have it up right now, but I will check it. I try to respond to emails as much as possible, unless that I've gotten 6 emails about the same thing, and then I usually try and fix the problem in an announcement. But you should see a response to anything you ask me very quickly. All right, so public opinion, we've got the law, right? We've got the de jure, the law. How does the law work? We've got the government. How does the government work? But the thing is that you don't follow all of the rules, right? You don't follow all the rules. You don't just interact with government. You also have your life, right? And while government, especially American government, is in your daily life, right? Your perception of it is going to be defined by very different things, right? And some of them exist in your childhood, right? And we'll talk about this as we move forward, right? By the time that you get here to UNLV, you have a fairly cohesive set of ideas, right? About how government works, how it should work, right? Usually from your parents and your friends, right? You sort of consolidate around that, right? If your parents are conservative, you're much more likely to be conservative. If your parents are liberal, you're more likely to be liberal, right? We'll talk about what this means and how this works as we go through this. So when I mean public opinion, I just mean their attitudes about issues, leaders, institutions, and events. How do you feel about things? And not just good, bad, but how should they work? How, right? This is very normative in the process, right? And you're very easy, public opinion is very easily influenced. I could easily convince you of something minor in this classroom, right? That sort of shift your opinion in one way or the other. It will try not to do that, right? That's never my intent, right? You should be taking tests and then getting out of here to get back to your majors, or if you're a political science major, you should be going more in depth. A value is just a basic principle, right? And when I talk about value or belief, it's not a governmental thing, right? When I talk about value or belief, right, a value would be people should work for what they should earn what they get, right? That's a value, right? That people don't deserve anything, they should just work hard, and what they get is what they deserve, right? That's a sort of very conservative libertarian view, right? You should work hard to get things you want. Or, right, if you're a younger generation, right, sort of Gen Z, right, that healthcare is an absolute right. This is a value, right, that everyone should have a right to sort of healthcare, right, or someone should always be there to catch you if you fall, right? These are different values that we have. Why are we paying so much in taxes if they're not rising? Or, right, education should be provided, right, especially college education. It's very unfortunate because you're at this position where by the time anything happens, you'll be done with your bachelor's. But we are seeing a transition where Americans believe that you have a right to healthcare and you have a right, a civil right, right, that the government has to engage in this. Their value is that the government should be doing these things for people, providing these safety nets. All of you, right, very, very few people are getting Social Security. All of you think that at the end of your life, the government should provide you Social Security because you're going to pay into it. You may not understand that process exactly, right? But you believe if I pay into a program my whole life, then I should get benefits at the end of it. That's the way it's designed, right? So that's a value that's sort of consolidated in the United States. Political ideology is a little different because it's a set of beliefs. We'll talk about a platform, a party platform later, but an ideology is sort of surrounded of, I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, I'm a libertarian, right? And they have all of these values together, right? A libertarian doesn't just mean, okay, all taxation is theft and limited government, but also most libertarians say you shouldn't be provided services unless you can afford them. You shouldn't be provided certain things, right? Extreme libertarians would say if you go to the hospital and you can't afford treatment, they should be allowed to let you die, which in the United States, they're not allowed to let you die, right? They have to stabilize you. But libertarians would have this cohesive beliefs that those beliefs around less taxation, isolationist policy, right? We shouldn't be involved in the rest of the world. The rest of the world can take care of itself, right? And then if you can't afford something, you don't have a right to it, right? That's a cohesive set of beliefs that are connected to a singular political ideology. Now, ideologies change, values change, but usually ideology changes so slowly that for the next 10 years, you're going to have the same ideology. And then later in life, you might transition based on where you're at. An attitude is a preference. So your value is everyone should work hard. And then the government's going to come out with a policy that says there are more unemployment benefits. And your attitude is whether you say, I don't like that they're giving more unemployment to people right now because they should be out working, right? It's sort of a disincentive for them to work. Or we're in the middle of a pandemic and we should be helping people as much as we can, right? That's your response. An attitude is a response. It's reactionary to a policy, right? So that's how you can distinguish between the value. Your values exist before government, and then after a government policy comes out, your values determine your attitude about something, right? It's a chronological chain where attitudes come afterwards. So when we talk about political values, we talked about this a lot. We'll probably talk about it through the rest of the semester, right? You have liberty and you have equality. And liberty and equality are always at odds with each other, right? This is not a conservative liberal divide, right? Government is always trying, right? The American government at its most ideal is always trying to provide the most liberty and the most equality. Right? How do I make sure that the government isn't involving itself in your life as much as possible? Right? The sort of Reagan idea, let's get government out of your life whenever we can. But also, how do I make sure that you have the ability to use all of your talents to succeed? Right? How do I make sure that anything that you have as an ability, you are allowed to use? Right? If we think about this classroom, right, I'm going to do a review. I've been doing a review. People who are good with technology do better in my classroom. It's an open note, open book text, right? All my tests, all my work is open note, open book. If you're very good at technology and very good at finding answers quickly, documents, right? If you know hotkeys like Control F, so you can just search the documents. If you know how to combine PDFs, right? You have an advantage. That's not a violation of equality of opportunity because you're using your talents, right? Your natural skill set or the skill set that you have learned up until this point might give you an advantage, but equality of opportunity says you all get to use your abilities to maximize your efforts. Some of you are very, very bad at communicating that you need help or that trying to collaborate, right? I'm very bad at that, right? When I say I need to collaborate, it's very difficult for me to work with someone else. So my skill set is very different, right? But the reason why I do well in school, right, or the reason why I did well in school in the past, right, was that I was very good at technology. I could find the answer very quickly, right? But I was very good at collaborating, right? So when it comes to instructing and learning techniques from other people, right, I'm disadvantaged in that one. So when you're trying to balance these two, liberty and equality of opportunity, you always have a side that you can pick. And remember that we're a two-party system. So if I am a Republican and I'm pushing really hard for liberty, right, the response by the Democrats has to be pushing very hard for equality, right? Because they're on opposite sides. They have to remain on opposite sides because there's only two people that can compete, right? We're either going to elect a Democrat or Republican. And we'll talk about third party later and why it's not as functional in the United States. It's not impossible. But for the most part, all of you in this room already know. You already know if you stand right with the Democrats or the Republicans. And if you stand with either party, you are against the other one, right? If you're a Republican, you're anti-Democrat. And if you're a Democrat, you're definitely anti-Republican, right? And now we have it very, very clearly, right? You're either Trump or Biden, right? And if you're for one, you're definitively against the other, right? There's no middle ground anymore, right? And we'll talk about when there used to be middle ground. It doesn't exist today. And it probably won't exist for a while because now we're isolated. So we're not even interacting with each other except on social media, and we'll talk about that later, why that's not a good way to interact if you're trying to express political thought. All right, so what do I mean by liberalism? A liberal in the United States, right, because in the rest of the world, liberal means something very different. An American liberal is someone who supports political and social reform, right? Now, right now, it's police reform and immigration reform and tax reform, but liberals are about changing the government so that they can provide more services, help more people, right? When we talk about reform, it's change in order to provide greater services, right? That's what liberals have become today. What reforms can exist that I can provide better services, or I can reduce the burden on certain individuals, right? Conservatives are status quo defenders. And a status quo is just where you're at right now. Right? Look at most of the fights that individuals have had in the past, right? Often conservatives are being put in place where they say, no, let's not do this. Let's stick with what we have. And whenever the status quo changes with like the Affordable Care Act, right, you start hearing the language that you hear now in the Republican Party, or at least when they interview Trump supporters, about going back in time, right? Think about those slogans that they use, right? Make America great again, right? These MAGA slogans, right? That you need to go back in time to a point where we were good and get back to that, right? Conservatives are about the status quo that existed in the past, or about keeping the status quo from changing and getting back to a point where they believe everything was good, right? Now, when you ask them, it's very complex about how they respond, right? Very clearly, some of them don't have an understanding of history, or we use this term, older people use the term about rose-colored glasses. This idea that when you look into the past, everything is better, right? Glenn Beck, who's no longer on Fox anymore, he had this problem. He had a really bad problem with this. He would talk about, when I was a kid, ice cream was much cheaper, right? Of course it was cheaper when you were a kid. You didn't pay for it, right? You didn't pay for ice cream as a kid. That's when you're looking back at history and you're saying, oh, things were better. You remember positive aspects of your past much more frequently than you do negative aspects about your past, right? We have a self-defense mechanism in our brains that says, don't think negative thoughts about your past, try to focus on the good things. And because we remember good things more likely, when we look into the past, we're like, oh, remember when the past was great and today is awful, right? A lot of people will talk about, right, in the 90s, kids got more toys, people had more income, right? The sort of great day of the 90s. I grew up in the 90s, and one of the things that they don't talk about, right, is smog, right? Smog was an issue in the 1990s, right? That's why we had Captain Planet and all of that stuff, right? But the air was much less breathable in the Southwest, right? And massive amounts of discrimination, right? We just talked about these groups, right? The discrimination was widespread in most communities, right? So that's the thing, is we look back and we say, oh, kids in the 90s, they had all these toys and these great things. But meanwhile, if you were a minority kid in the 90s, you were much more likely to be murdered by a hate crime. You were much more likely to be assaulted or denied certain rights and privileges, right? So when we look in the past, most people do this problematically. Conservatives do this more because conservatives typically are the majority, right? The white majority, the Protestant majority. We said this term called a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? A WASP, right? they had all of the power and they had control over the government for a long period of time. So now at the end of the 20th century and going into the 21st, they feel like they're losing, right? Some of them have this belief that equality, what is actually equality, they see as discrimination, right? They're like, why are you giving that to someone else but not me? Whenever you try and level the playing field, the majority is always going to say, why are you taking from me to give to them, right? So that you're going to have that. So when they look in the past, conservatives will often say the past was better, and we should hold to that. But a conservative is about that status quo, getting back to it or holding to that point. And the status quo is just how life was at any given moment, right, before the change. A libertarian is someone who emphasizes freedom and only believes in voluntary association. So a libertarian would want there to be a very, very weak federal government, really just emergency response like national defense, right, and sort of natural disasters. And then everything else would be voluntary, right? Libertarians would say things like, we shouldn't have a firefighting group. There should be no firefighters. That should all be voluntary. We should not have public roads. If you want a road, you should have a private road that's paid for by the people who use that road, right? If you want a hospital or insurance, you should be choosing whether to buy that, right? Anytime that you are forced to make a purchase or pay taxes, a libertarian would take issue, right? There should be very, very limited taxation, right? And extremes, right? All taxation is theft. The solution they would talk about is like, if you wanted to buy something and there were taxes on that thing, then that's voluntary, right? If I want to buy a soda and there's sales tax on it, that's voluntary taxation because I could choose not to buy that soda. But income tax is not voluntary, and therefore it violates your rights. On the other end of this is a socialist. So one of the weird things is you see free markets is italicized. We're just going to ignore that for now. But for socialists, right, it's this idea of strong government, reducing economic inequality, and social ownership, right? That we should have a stake in everything, right? That we should be providing services. And then if there is economic inequality, there should be ways to address that, right? Bernie Sanders is the most obvious example, right? He's a democratic socialist. He says that we should have free education because that will help resolve the economic inequality that we have in the United States, right? People who have been systemically impoverished, who don't have access to education, right? If we gave them access to education, they would do better, right? And then over a generation, right, those children would do better, and then that part of that community would no longer be in poverty, right? That's one of the arguments that democratic socialists make, right, progressives make, is that instead of constantly having to provide services to poor people, why don't we give them education and training and give them some opportunity, right? And it sounds very Republican in the way it's set up, right? But we should do it for free. Not that they should pay to better themselves, but if they're historically impoverished or systematically discriminated against, right, we should provide them some service that allows them to get to the next step. So that's a socialist argument, right? If you look up socialism, you'll get something a little more Marxist, but that's American socialism is more about just providing services to reduce economic inequality. Then there is a moderate. The thing about a moderate is no one's a moderate, right? No one's in the center. Everyone likes to think they're in the center, which is why public opinion is very powerful. Everyone likes to think, oh, I'm a moderate, I'm a centrist, I'm very balanced, I'm very tolerant, I'm in the middle, right? And sort of working together. But what we have to recognize is that each of you is either on the left or the right. None of you are in the center, right? If you think that college education should be cheaper or free, then you are liberal. You're on the left, right? If you think that police reform should exist, you're on the left. If you think that you should be allowed to pray in schools or that school prayer is being sort of discriminated against, then you're on the right, right? But even if you think something as simple as we need to reform water sort of recycling, then you're either a left or right issue. There is no one who's really in the middle anymore. It's very, very rare. No. So, okay. It's a really good question. So independents are people who identify as independent. When we talk about a liberal or a conservative, that's your political ideology. Independent is a registered party position. So you can register as a Republican, you can register as a Democrat, but Democrat and liberal are different. Being liberal is an ideology, being Democrat is part of a party. So independents, they like to think they're moderate, right? But what they are is non-party aligning individuals. Because when we look at independence, this is why moderates don't really exist. A moderate would be centralized in everything, right? Very balanced, very compromising, right? How do I fit in the middle of this? How do I make a bridge between both groups, right? A moderate is trying to build a bridge between groups. What we have found in the United States is independents are typically part of a party who find value, personal value, and identify as an independent. Because if you ask an independent about certain issues, it'll be very clear that they are either a Democrat or Republican. And when we look at the voting records of independents, they vote for the same party consistently, right? If you're an independent, but you voted for a Democrat in the past election, you probably voted for a Democrat in the past 10 elections. And the same is true for Republicans. So independence is a registration on a party where you say, oh, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but it doesn't align with your ideology. And we know now independent is sort of this thing that Americans want to be for its own value. Like, I'm an independent because I'm not tied to both parties because they're garbage, right? But that's a statement that that person is making, right, in order to say something about themselves, right? Public opinion works both ways. The public, right, the government is signaling to you what they want you to believe. You're signaling to the government the values that you have, right? So independent voters are just people who don't register to a specific party. So that's a documentation, whereas a moderate is an ideology. Hopefully does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. So we see some independents, but when we look at independents, they always are either very left-leaning or very right-leaning, right? An independent 90% of the time votes for the same party. Very few people switch. They're either always a Republican or always a Democrat. We don't see a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm going to vote for this Republican and that Democrat. That's why presidential elections matter so much. You're going to go out, people vote more in presidential election. If you vote for Biden, you're going to continue voting for Democrats all the way down. If you vote for Trump, you're going to continue voting for Republicans all the way down. So they don't mix and match, right? The ideology is separate because you're voting with party, but we know independents don't really do that. They just like to call themselves independents.
So what is the like
Yeah, so libertarians are much more common in Nevada, and part of it is that the government doesn't have the right. It's not that life is better. It's not that they think, oh, life is better if everyone just takes care of themselves and there won't be hardship or anything like that. It's this belief that the way the government is organized, the way the Constitution is worded, that the government has no right to involve itself in these factors, right? They say taxation is theft because a libertarian, a very sort of dyed-in-the-wool, very hardcore libertarian would say, you can't tax me because there's nothing in the Constitution and the federal government that allows you to tax my income, right? You're taxing my income, there's no right to it. So a libertarian has this belief that the government has no right to do those things. And we know, right, Article 1, Section 8, right, this necessary and proper clause, there's a lot of things they can do that isn't explicitly stated in the Constitution, but a libertarian would reject that. So part of that is the government has no right to do what it's doing. It needs to stop because it has no right to do that. The other part is that libertarians often believe that government intervention damages people. That by making you buy a product, right? When we talk about the Affordable Care Act, there used to be an individual mandate, right? By forcing you to buy health insurance, right, they're damaging you. They're making you spend money that you may not have. Or by introducing laws that don't allow you to sell your organs, right? A libertarian would always say, why can't you sell your organs? You can't, right? In the United States, you're not. I mean, there might be some loopholes. But you're not allowed to sell your organs. A libertarian would say, well, if you're poor and you're trying to get yourself out of poverty and you have 2 kidneys, then you should sell one of those kidneys to better your life, right? Now, that's very problematic if you're a liberal. You're like, why does a poor person have to sell their kidney just to catch up to, right, someone else who hasn't been discriminated against? A libertarian would say, if you really want equality of opportunity, you should be allowed to sell your services in any way that puts you in a better position. And the government shouldn't be allowed to stop you from that. So, right, they're very, very focused on the liberty. They're not as focused on the sort of equality of opportunity, right? You should be free from government control. And so libertarians, right, they don't want any restrictions on guns. They were very successful. The NRA is a libertarian organization for guns rights, right? The government has no right to do it. So that's their cohesive idea, is that the government shouldn't be involved in your life. And usually libertarians have a pocket, they're more likely to hold a pocket constitution, right? Look at the Constitution, look at what it explicitly says. There's no right based on this that they should be allowed to do that, right? So the constitutionalists and libertarians align a little bit. But that's the argument that they make. Whereas, right, just as a contrast, a liberal or a progressive or a socialist, right, they would say we need to do more. The government should, not that they have a legal right, but that they should get in your life to make it better. Government should be trying to make your life better. Whereas libertarians said there's no right to do it. So hopefully that clears up the difference between what a libertarian is. Right? And we'll talk about this more when we talk about more specific issues. Wait, are there any more questions? Really good questions, guys. I'm glad you're engaging. Are there any more questions? Okay. So how do you even get to where you have this political ideology? The way that this happens is through political socialization. And political socialization works in a very specific way. You were born, right, without getting into like political theory and tabula rasa and starting as a blank slate. When you're born, you don't have political values. And so for the first 5 years in your life, right, for almost all people, right, that your parents are the only ones, right, that you interact with. They control every aspect of your life. They control what inputs you see. They control who you spend time with. They control every part of your life. So by the time you're 5 and 6 years old, you have learned a lot of socialization from your parents, right? And we call these agents of socialization. And so the way socialization works is every day I do something, whether consciously or subconsciously, that starts telling you about what's right and wrong, about political culture, about beliefs and values, right? My mom is a preschool teacher. So every interaction I had with her as a kid was the value of education, right? My mom always instilled that in me, not even just through what she said, right, but through her actions. Education, being in school, being part of school was such a big part of her life, right, that it started to become part of my life, right? It's not necessarily just random chance that she's an educator and I'm an educator, right? Socialization, that's how it works, right? If you have parents who are very good at math, right, not only can they help you with math, but they also start teaching you the value of math, right? And so the same happens with political socialization. If you grow up with people who are racist or bigoted, then by the time you're an adult, you might have those racist and bigoted ideas, because not only has it become normalized, right, that over and over and over again you've seen this happen, right, but your parents have been telling you through either action or direct speech that this is the right way to be, right? This is the way that you should be. This is the way that you should behave. So that's the most obvious example, right? My grandparents are racist. And so I was raised in part by my grandparents, not that that's really relevant, right? But growing up with them, they had very strange sort of views about minorities, right? And so until I went to a very diverse high school, I had beliefs about minorities that were wrong, right? That they repeatedly had told me, and they were clearly wrong, right? And so then, right, I had already established some values, and it's much more difficult to change those values, right? We'll talk about how that can happen later, right? So your family's there, your social networks are there. By the time you're 8 to 12, you start making friends, and your friends have had different parents. And so this is the first time in your life that you start changing your values, right? You socialize into different values. I'm using a lot of negative examples, but that's not my intent, right? I'm sure there are positive examples too. My friend in high school, right, he was Chinese. His parents made him a Chinese lunch every day. After about 2 weeks of that, right, he stopped bringing that food and he got his parents to buy him the school lunch, right? That's negative socialization, right? His peer group, his social network, and his people, he was so different from the other people in our group that he sort of assimilated into that group, right? Now it's sort of sad because the food is better than the food that my parents made, right? But right at the time, right, as kids, you sort of force assimilation. So socialization happens with kids, it happens with family. Your family has been doing it longer, so they have primacy. They start earlier, so they have more influence in your values, and they control who you're friends with until you're to a certain age, so they're under control. At about 16, 17, you have pretty clear political views, right? If you grow up in a very white part of town, in a rural area, you're much more likely to be conservative and Republican, conservative Republican, right? Ideology party, right? So if you grow up in a very urban area that's very diverse, right, and you have minority parents, you're much more likely to be liberal and a Democrat, a registered Democrat if you tend to vote. Now, when you're young, you don't vote, right? You don't register, and right, there's all these issues with that. Then you get into the late years of your high school, you take civics, and then what we know is some people, when they get more education, right, or typically as you get more education, and then when you go to college, right, why are you being forced to be in this classroom? Because education allows you to reassess your values, right? It gives you the skill set to reassess. Why do we call it humanities, right? Why are you taking, right, most of you are not political science majors, why are you taking a political science course? Because this is the opportunity for education to allow you to check in on your values and your beliefs, right? We are supposed to be giving you enough tools to analyze what your beliefs are and if they really align with who you want to be, right? Now, we happen to know that with more education, we typically lean more liberal, but unless they're very wealthy, and then it typically doesn't matter, right? If you come from very wealthy parents, education doesn't push you into a more liberal mindset. But if you're not from any like high wealth, then almost all people, as they interact with education, they become more liberal. For whatever reason, right? That it might just be that some of the values are based in ignorance, and as you get more information, that ignorance can't hold up, right? A lot of racism ends in colleges because you can't retain that ignorance about that other community, that stereotype, you're constantly interacting with it, especially in a diverse school like UNLV, right? If you're in a very, very homogenous school, maybe not so much, right? But we know this interaction changes you, right? We talked about this before, the socialization of you're in a group, in a very diverse group right now, right? That you interact with different views. So it forces you to sort of review what you have, and education gives you those critical analysis tools. Is my belief inaccurate? Not wrong, I don't like this word wrong, right? We're not gonna talk about morality, but do I believe things that aren't true, right? Most of you believe things that aren't true, absolutely, right? You're young enough to not remember that Slender Man was created by a specific person, right? I remember the creation of Slender Man, right? When that person wrote that story of Slender Man. And if you don't know who Slender Man is, don't look it up, it's horrific, right? But, right, for people who are younger, right, that they might watch or interact with that mythology now, that developed mythology, and they might buy into it more, right? But I remember the specific author who won a competition with that, and so my beliefs are a little different. So if you believe in something and then someone's like, I wrote this story myself, I created it, right? It's a mythology, right? That forces you to reassess. And if you believe in Slender Man, I don't know how to communicate anything else with you, right? But it's very clear that when you're represented with that, it's the most benign example I can come up with. But there are other things, right, that most people misunderstand how things work, and with new information, it's harder for them to hold to their beliefs that are wrong, or that are inaccurate, excuse me. Okay. So now when we talk about public opinion, we want to see how public opinion interacts with social groups. And the first is race. And I've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to go too much into this. But there's a book called Blackness Visible by Charles Mills. And Charles Mills makes this argument that it's impossible for me as a white person to know the perspective of a black person, specifically a black male, because he's a black male. And what he's talking about, now his view, whether you agree, is not really the point. The way he describes it, the way he describes how it works is what matters. His argument is that as a black male, you spend your life being treated differently, right? And he's talking about East Coast, so I don't really know the East Coast that well. But if you're walking down the street and you're a black male and someone else is walking on the same side of the street and they see you, they will cross the street to avoid you. Especially females will cross the street to avoid you. If you go into a store and you will feel eyes on you or be followed as you're going through that store. Charles Mills is a little older, so I don't know how commonplace this is now, right? But in the 80s and 90s, it used to be a lot more common for minorities to be followed by the store owners through the store because of the belief that they would steal. Right? Ignorant or not, that's not really the point. His argument is that every time you have that interaction, and it's over and over and over again, that your perception of reality is different, right? That if I were to interact with a police officer, my perception of how that would go would be very different than most of you, right? My perception would be very different, right? And we can look at that, and we now, because we have video cameras everywhere, we can see very differently, right? I'm actually not behind. So if you've seen this video, this kid, he tested positive for COVID and he was throwing a house party and the police pull him over, right? Most of you have seen this video, right? The police is very calm, right? He seems very calm. The individual has clearly done something wrong, but because the law is not clear, the police officer doesn't know how to interact with him. He probably is gonna get a fine or something like that. But the interaction is very peaceful, it's very calm, right? And then you look at interactions that people post when minorities are interacting with police officers, it's not calm. It's very physical, right? A big reform movement right now, right? There's supposed to be, I haven't been watching the news in the last few days, right? There's supposed to be news about whether or not they're going to prosecute the individuals involved in the Breonna Taylor case, right? So that interaction is very, very different, right? If you're a minority, your interactions. So over time, what socialization argues and what Charles Mills argues is your perception is so different that we can't even see the same way. We don't see things the same way, right? And I'll use one more example. Koreans often talk about the sky being green, right? Americans would say the sky is blue, right? Koreans would say the sky is green. Now, in part, they live on a peninsula in sort of an ocean peninsula. So there is more of a green hue to the sky for them, right? That's a very normal thing, right? In the same way that a Hawaiian would say that they wouldn't really talk about a blue sky because there's a lot of color variation in the Hawaiian sky. So when you have that, when you live in that, your perception becomes very different, right? And it's hard to reassess. If someone told you the sky is green today, you would say, what are you even talking about? Is there fires or something else? Yet that perception would be so misaligned. Charles Mills buys into that. So the argument really matters for us because it works that way. And when our perceptions are that different, of course, our policies and our public opinion is going to be very different. The next part is ethnicity. So ethnicity is not race. Ethnicity would be something very specific, right? Sometimes we talk about, like you have an Armenian population in the United States, specifically Las Vegas, right? And Armenians are an ethnicity. They're also a nationality because they have their own country, right? But ethnicity exhibits very differently because you can't always see ethnicity, right? You always see race, right? Now, without, I know, I don't think it's popular anymore, but it used to be popular that people would say, oh, I don't see color, I don't see race, right? That's ignorance, right? That you always see that person's differences. You see their physical differences, right? Not that they matter, but you see them. Ethnicity, you don't see them, right? A Protestant and a Catholic are different, but you don't necessarily see how they're different on sort of right when you walk up to them, right? So ethnicity works in that way. So social groups and public opinion, it's not as clear because two different ethnic groups might be treated the same way in the United States, right? Someone from El Salvador and someone from Honduras is not treated differently in the United States because most Americans think they're the same group, right? If you talk about, right, being sort of in a certain area, right? I was just doing some research, right? If you're in the East Coast, right, and you see someone with brownish skin, you think they're Puerto Rican or Cuban. But if you see someone on the West Coast and you're part of the white majority, that person's Mexican, right? So that perception is very different. So ethnicity is a little more complicated because there's nuance there that people don't see, and sometimes the interactions are very different, right? And usually it's in practice, right? If you see someone doing something different, right? Races, you see them and they look different. Ethnicity, you see someone and they're behaving differently. And their different behavior creates an issue for sort of public opinion, right? We think different things about certain people based on their ethnicity, but we don't always see it in the way that they look. Not that that's right in any way, right? But I'm talking about what actually happens in public opinion, not what should happen. The next part is gender or sex, right? So in the law, we're going to talk about this maybe later. Gender is not sex, but sometimes it is, right? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. The law is not always clear in this way. When I talk about a gender gap, I actually mean a sex gap, but the terminology in the text and the terminology in American politics is this, what's called a gender gap. And what I mean by a gender gap is a difference. There's a distinction in the voting pattern between females and males, right? And it's very obvious why, right? Whenever you see a vote about marriage or about children or about abortion, females will vote differently, right? They will vote differently, right? It may not be as big, but especially when it comes to reproductive rights. And by reproductive rights, I mean, do you have a right to decide when and if you have children, right? Are you allowed access to birth control? Are you allowed to use an IUD? Do you have to get your parents' permission, right, to get an abortion, right? All of these things, these reproductive rights become different, and because they impact females, right, cisgender females, if we're going to use that very, very specific language, they're impacted differently, so they vote differently, right? Their voting behavior is very different. We already talked about religion. Religion and ethnicity are very, very different, but, right, both of them have practices that sort of isolate them, right? If you are Catholic, right, Catholics are anti-birth control, right? That birth control is a sin, right? So if you are part of a Catholic group and you are engaging with a government that provides birth control for free, right, you're going to be against Planned Parenthood. Whereas Protestants don't have the same issue with Planned Parenthood, right? But Catholics see everything that they're doing, right? If you equate abortions and birth control pills as equivalent, right? If you say those two are equivalent, right, then your views against Planned Parenthood are going to be very different as a Catholic than they would be as someone who's a different religion or someone who's not religious at all. So all of these exist before we even get to party. That's part of the thing that we want to make sure we talk about when we're talking about public opinion. You are born a certain race and ethnicity. You were raised in a religion. You were born one sex, or you identify as one gender, right? All of these things happen way before you get to political representation. So you have an identity. It's socialized through your friends and through your family. And then the party starts coming involved because you can't vote until you're 18. And most of you don't, right? Most 18-year-olds don't vote until, right? It's not until they get to their 20s and 30s that they start voting. Please vote, right? This is a very important vote. It's a presidential election, so, right? But young people typically don't vote because the last part is party affiliation and then economic class and group self-interest. So at some point you say, okay, I'm going to be part of this party, or I'm going to be part of that party. And that's tied into all these other values you have. And then that's sort of modified by your economic class, right? If you are very wealthy, you're much more likely to be a Republican, right? If you have more money, you want to pay less in taxes because you're not getting anything in services. If you have no money, you want more services, and you're fine with more taxes because if you want to tax me a little more to actually make sure I can take care of myself, then that's acceptable, right? So economic class really matters, and we talked about that. And then group self-interest, right? If you are a minority group that has a deal with citizenship, right? We talked about the Latinx, you want there to be a better path to citizenship. That's group self-interest, right? Which is very normal, right? I'm not picking on that group in any way, right? Every group has its own self-interest that they want to be served. And then the last part is the political environment. I think we might talk about this a little more, but political environment is today, right? The political environment of 2020 is entirely different from the political environment of 2018, right? The issues that we face today will not be issues that we face in hopefully will not be issues we face in 2022, right? We're in a political environment right now that is focused on the economy and disease, right? There are other issues, right? And of course, police reform, but I don't think that's dividing voters, right? If you're for police reform, you were already a Democrat. You were already for police reform in 2018, right? Police reform, right? Police brutality was an issue in 2018. It's just that protests have become much more common today because there seems to be an escalation on both sides, right? Not I hate this language of both sides, right? Because it reminds me of Trump when he says it's good people on both sides, right? You have more protests and you have more cases of police brutality, right? You have more evidence of both, right? And not the right or wrong, but we have more videos where we see clear evidence of police brutality, and we have more protests in 2020. But we've had the same issue in 2018. That's not part of the political environment. The coronavirus is part of the political environment of 2020, right? RBG, right, is part of the 2020 political environment, right? Should they be allowed to put someone into the Supreme Court this close to an election, right? If you're following, right, 2016, they said no, and now they're changing their mind, right? That's political environment. That's specific to this moment in time, right? So we have to say, okay, here are all these values I have, but I also have to put myself in the context of this moment because each moment is different, right? Each election will be different. Okay. So you have all these things that form your political opinion, but are they stable, right? Do they hold, right? Because what some people will say is you won't hold the same opinion for any period of time. And we've done some research, right? That if I ask you a question and then 20 minutes later, I show you a video or I distract you in some way and ask you a question again, you're going to give me two answers, right? This is Schumter in the past, right? And some other argues, I want to say Pearson. Authors have done this research. None of you have a consistent political ideology. If I ask you a question slightly differently every day, you'll give me a slightly different answer every day, right? But your political ideology will jump all over the place. Some days you're going to be really conservative, and some days you're going to be super liberal, right? If you had to pay a big parking ticket or something yesterday, and I ask you about parking, you're going to be really angry and say, well, we should limit parking, and we should get rid of all this enforcement, we should change it, right? But if the next day, right, someone is blocking you and parking enforcement is very helpful in getting you out of your parking space so you can get out of there, your views are going to be different. So political ideology is often shifting really fast, right? And so even if you hold a clear view, your opinion wavers. Public opinion is very, very fickle. It goes left to right all the time, right? Right now, right, we are definitively sort of, most of the public is sort of arguing, right, that we should be in mourning rather than sort of trying to get a new Supreme Court justice in, right? But also because, right, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was so important in our iconography and our views, right, and our culture, that there wants to be this moment, right? And also because in 2020, we've had more than our fair share of sort of tragic deaths, right? That it's sort of becoming the standard for this year, right? But because of that, right now we're holding this point. If the president were to nominate another female, right, and that female in public opinion could easily sway into, okay, that person's fine, right? That person's an acceptable replacement. Public opinion is so fickle that it can move very quickly. We know that, right, while there is some court continuance of the Breonna Taylor case, there isn't the protests as much, right? There isn't as much movement, right? Public opinion is very fickle, right? The NFL is sort of playing right now. They're wearing a lot of gear that has people's names on it, or racial equality issues. On October 1st, all of that will go away. I guarantee that it'll all go away, because October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month in the NFL, right? So public opinion is very fickle, and they jump back and forth, right? So you will not see as much talk about racial inequality in October, because October is all about cancer awareness, right? Our public opinion will shift, because we're not talking about it anymore, we need to focus on something else, right? Our shift will focus. So because of that, you don't always need a ton of knowledge. You don't need to know everything about every policy. That would be a waste of your time, right? And I'm a rational choice proponent, right? So you want to spend the least amount of effort to get the maximum output, right? What's the least amount of information that I can go and get, right? I don't want to spend hours every day following this stuff, right? I don't watch the news because I don't want to spend hours every day when it's just going to change from day to day, right? I spend my time reading texts and articles, right? I value my time that way. You should value your time that way, right? So rationally, you don't have to keep track of every policy. Everyone's going to be elected. What you can do is use a shortcut. And the shortcut can be party ID. You know that if you are pro-choice and you are pro-Green Deal, or you want sort of to make sure that climate change is being addressed in a way, a very functional way, and that you want to move towards more, right, renewable energy, then you're a Democrat. And so you don't have to research every single Democrat. I'm not arguing for this. I'm just saying this is the argument that's placed, the theoretical argument, that you can just look at someone's party ID and that could determine whether or not you're going to vote for them, whether or not you're going to support their policy, right? If Biden's for it and you're a Democrat, then you're for it. You may not think it's the perfect plan. You might think you want to go more towards Bernie Sanders or AOC, right? But you're like, I'm going to go with whatever Biden's going with, because it's definitely going to be better than what the Republicans put out, right? So sometimes we talk about party ID, and the other thing is skim and scan. And skim and scan is something that most of you will probably already are familiar with, right? You just look to find the words or the sections that really fit with what you already think. And that's the problem about shortcuts and cues, right? You only look for the things that match with what you're existing now. When we talk about social media, we'll talk about this, right? Echo chamber stuff. You're only getting information that you want, and you're only picking and choosing the stuff that you want to retain, right? So shortcuts and cues is very useful in a rational choice perspective. You're not wasting your time, but also you can miss a lot, and you're only going to reinforce pre-existing views. It's very difficult to break from. That's why education is so effective. I can force you to listen, right? Or I can force you to sit here. You don't necessarily have to listen, right? But I can force you to go over some of these processes, right? And that makes you reassess. Okay. So let's talk about how these shortcuts cost specifically. The most obvious example in the 21st century is the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act is Obamacare, right? Obamacare is a slang term for the Affordable Care Act. There is literally no difference between them. But what we saw in 2016 and 2018, people saying, I don't have Obamacare, I have the Affordable Care Act. There is no such thing as Obamacare, right? Obamacare is not a real thing. The Affordable Care Act produced abilities to buy insurance, it produced exchanges, right? Obamacare is a term to describe that aspect, right? So what you would have is say, oh, we should get rid of Obamacare, but it won't impact me because I have the ACA, right? Clearly, because that person is not doing enough research, they're going to cost themselves. They're going to get rid of something that they use in such a way that damages them because they haven't gotten enough information. To use a non-American example, right? The United Kingdom separated from the European Union. They called it Brexit. It's getting somewhat dated. the most searched term after the vote, right? The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. The next day, the most searched term in the United Kingdom was, what is the European Union, right? They voted to leave the European Union one day, and then they figured out what the European Union was the next day after they had voted to leave it, right? So because of that, right, it's very clear that they were for separating, right? They were pushed by public opinion saying, we need to stop giving up certain things, so we need to leave this community, this economic community, to benefit ourselves, but they didn't understand that aspect, right? So shortcuts are very useful rationally, but they come at costs, right? They come at cost to democracy, because a lot of times we'll vote for things that don't really align with what you want, right? We know now the UK is going to be in a lot of economic trouble because it's not part of this customs union of the European Union, right? That it's going to cost the UK in a way that they didn't want to cost. And because part of it was based in racism, they're trying to get certain workers out of the UK. The UK just gave them visas, so it didn't do the thing that they were expecting it to do. All right. So if you can be wrong, if you can be inaccurate, if you can get information that's inaccurate, and you have all these values and views, then how does this work, right? How do we get views into the public opinion? And what we use is a marketplace of ideas. And this is just a public forum where all of us introduce ideas, the same way that you would think about sort of like a Facebook argument, right? But this is done through news channels and pundits and sort of just everyday discussions, right? You're talking to your friend about something and you're watching some news show. This whole marketplace exists in sort of the ether, right? You're having these conversations, and every idea, every value, every belief is being exchanged. It's competing, right? These ideas are competing in such a way, in the same way that you would expect a business to compete, right? A lot of people here like Cane's, right? That, not in this room, but right, Cane's is very popular in this area, right? There's just a lot of Cane's businesses. I've never actually eaten at Cane's, right? Obviously, because I don't eat anything that comes from them, but it's very popular. The thing is it's very popular here because of marketing campaigns, right? It's been convinced that it fits with this community. There are a lot of communities where Cane's doesn't even exist, right? If you're from California, Cane's is not something you would see. You would see KFC or Popeyes, right? So they're all competing as businesses. Ideas compete the same way in a democracy, right? Trying to convince you. And in the same way that they're isolated regionally, some ideas really take hold in certain parts of the country and not other parts of the country. So how does an elected leader, right, get this idea out, right? They want to compete in this marketplace. Political leaders have what's called a bully pulpit. And all that means, a bully pulpit is it's kind of like a podium, but it originally was from a religious aspect, right? And it's raised. So we don't have that here, right? But the reason a bully pulpit is so effective, the reason why a leader is so effective, is that a bully pulpit, the person it's from I want to say a Protestant church, but I'm not that knowledgeable about religion. So the person speaking is about 4 feet above everyone else, right? So if I were over you looking down and I had this podium, I'm speaking from a position of power. And because I'm speaking to you from a position of power, you're more likely to believe me, right? When the president gives a speech or a briefing from the White House, that's the bully pulpit. He is speaking directly to the public in a position of power. And his position of power is demonstrated by the fact that he is in the White House or that he's behind a podium that has a presidential seal, right? That's the bully pulpit. I am speaking to a position of power. You're more likely to believe me. I'm speaking directly to the public, right? Especially when we talk about 21st century engagement, right? I can talk right to you and you can respond in real time, right? That's the bully pulpit. When you don't have the bully pulpit, you have to take other aspects, right? And we'll talk about mass media in a second. The most obvious way you can do this is through an interest group. And we already talked about this when we talked about AARP, right? The American Association of Retired People. Now it's just AARP, right? Over 30 million members, right? 30 million members who typically vote, who are paying dues to this community. That interest group can very effectively influence public opinion, right? AARP can give a grade to an official and change the outcome of an election, right? That's one interest group that can change an election, right? If AARP came out against Biden, Biden would lose, right? Now, that's not what will happen. AARP is probably going to support Biden, right? But the influence is very clear, right? Interest groups are very effective. And I think we have a whole chapter on it, so I won't spend too much time on it. The other is mass media. A pundit is an individual who clearly supports one side, who's often being paid to support one side, and sort of gives out talking points that individuals can use to defend their aspect, right? In 2016, right, pundits would start using this language of we're going to build the wall, right? And Mexico is going to pay for it, right? That's a talking point that pundits can give to people, and then those people can talk to other people about it, right? That's how that marketplace works, right? I tell you as a conservative that we're going to build a wall between the United States and Mexico, right? That's a talking point. Then you're talking to your family and your friends, and you talk about building the wall, right? It's communication that you have. The other part is an issue advocate, and we'll talk about, I think it's in the next one, but issue advocate is someone who's just pushing for a specific issue, right? We don't have as much of that now because we're so focused on, right, disease control and economics that we don't have as many issue advocates, and then editorialists. And editorialists, right, unfortunately, almost all news is opinion now, right? You don't have as much sort of breaking news, right? A lot of it's opinion and analysis, right? Editorialists are just people who take the news and sort of facts and sort of put them into a position where they're making an argument for you, right? This is how you should interpret the news. Okay. So when you have all this public opinion, right, it works in it's a two-way street. It works in both directions. Oh, goodness. An elected official will try and convince the public about what's right for them, and the public will tell the elected official what they want, right? The public is always saying, this is what we want. And elected officials in the government and pundits are always saying, this is how you should interpret things. So an elected official can work in two different ways. An elected official can be a trustee. A trustee is someone who says, I know what I should be doing to make your life better. So I'm not always going to do exactly what you want me to do, right? But I'm going to do the things, I'm going to try and produce the outcomes that you want, right? I'm not going to listen to exactly what you want me to do piece by piece, but I am going to try and find the solutions that I want, like that make your life better, right? A lot of elected officials are trustees, right? People in Las Vegas need better access to clean water. So as a trustee, right, if you elect me as a trustee, I'm going to go make access to clean water more available, right? Now, if you might say, I don't want to drink recycled water, well, that's not really an option for people in Las Vegas, right? Recycled water is going to be in your water, right, because of where we live. As a trustee, I say we're going to have to use recycled water. As a delegate, if you told me I don't want to use recycled water, I would do everything in my power to get rid of recycled water, even if it came at a consequence to us, right? A delegate is just someone who's told how to do their job by the voters, right? A delegate representative does whatever the voters tell him to do, him or her to do. A trustee comes from this position of, I'm an expert, you elected me because of my policy knowledge, I'm going to do what's best for you, but I may not always listen to you in the exact way that you want, right? A trustee often thinks, I know better. A delegate often thinks, I will do what you ask me to do, right? That's a trustee versus a delegate. There is a book by David Mayhew. It's called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And so Mayhewian politics is part of this argument that elected officials, part of what they want is just to get reelected, right? That their primary goal, and he sort of tests this assumption, which I won't get too much in the book, their primary goal is just to get reelected. And if their primary goal is just to get reelected, they're going to be delegates, right? You're much more likely to be a delegate representative because you're just going to do whatever it takes to get reelected in the next cycle. And trying to get elected in the next cycle is what matters most, and so that's your goal set, right? Your goal set is not about better policy or about better governance or about helping people more. It's about how do I get reelected? And that drives people. That's not exactly what David Mayhew's book talks about, but that's an argument that people make, that Mayhewian politics is this argument that everyone's just trying to get reelected. And reelection is more important than anything else, right? Why are Republicans really pushing for the Supreme Court justice to change? Not because, right, in part because they want to change the Supreme Court, but also if they are able to get the Supreme Court justice nominated and into the Supreme Court before the election, it will help them a lot in the election, right? They'll help them. They'll say, look at these things we can do, right? The Democrats are always trying to stop this, but look, we were able to get it in and they weren't, right? Even though they said before they shouldn't, right now they're going to say, yeah, that's not what actually I meant by that, right? but look how effective we are. Democrats couldn't get it done, and Scalia died in February of 2016, right? But we could get it done, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in September of 2020, right? That we only had a couple of weeks, and they had months and months, and they couldn't do it, right? The efficiency argument is there for them to get reelected. However, right, whenever you're doing this, right, whenever you're using public opinion to sort of get your case, it's very dangerous. Nixon, right, not Nixon, during the Vietnam War, right, without sort of tying presidents, during the Vietnam War, for a long time, there was a belief that we should be there, right? The public opinion was like, look, there's always anti-draft measurements, but that we were doing well in Vietnam, right? And then the Pentagon Papers came out. And it was clear that the military was lying about how many people were dying, how many Americans were dying, right? This was a leak during the Vietnam War. There was a leak, all these paperwork came out. The military had been hiding how many casualties. Then you have almost overnight this shift where the American population just says, nope, we're not going to, this is the wrong war to be in. We should not be in this war. It doesn't matter what you're fighting for. This is not a worthwhile sacrifice for us to be in that country, right? It shifts so dramatically that people who had the day before been for Vietnam War suddenly say, oh no, I'm against the war, I'm against the war. But if you didn't shift fast enough, right, you pay the electoral price. In 2008, right, same-sex marriage bans continued to go across. In 2010, anyone who supported a same-sex marriage ban, because between 2008 and 2010, right, you have these court cases that makes it legal. The Supreme Court says no, same-sex bans aren't constitutional. If you supported them in 2006 to 2009, all of a sudden you were going to be voted out of office because public opinion changes very quickly. It's very, very fickle, right? If you look at marijuana legalization in 2016 or whenever Nevada legalized it, it was still very controversial in the public. Now, almost all states have some version of legalization, whether it be CBD or medical use only, right? Almost all, I think 48 states now have CBD or medical use only laws where they can legally use marijuana, right? When you have that much of a shift in the states, right, obviously public opinion has shifted. And if you're still anti-legalization, it can cost you electorally, right? So public opinion is very fickle. It changes very rapidly. So how do we measure public opinion? Hold on. I don't know how many slides. Okay, good. This gets a little complex, so we got time. Excuse me. So the first part is how do we measure public opinion through polling, right? I'm going to go and I'm going to ask as many people as I possibly can, right? Public opinion poll. I'm going to go ask everyone how they feel about these things. But we want to make sure that we're doing this in a scientific way. So how do you do this, right? This is going to get kind of complicated. For those of you that haven't had like statistics or methods, right? If it goes over, ask me a question, but don't feel like you have to know every part of this. I will make it clear, right? If it's not a definition to one of these answers, then it's not a test answer. So if I'm explaining how statistics work and you're like, I am not prepared for that, that will not be part of the exam. I just going to use it to explain the definitions. The definitions are what matter. So if you're reviewing, make sure you know these definitions before we go to exam 2. Just for everyone live streaming in class, right? I do not expect you to know because I don't expect you to know how statistics work or how regressions work or anything like that. But I expect you to know this part of it. So we're doing a poll. The first thing is we need a sample. So the entire population of the United States that's the population, right? 370, however many million people there are in the United States. The sample is the number of people that you pull from the population, right? A sample is some subset of the population, right? So usually a small group, right? And it's expected to represent the entire population, right? So what I can do, right, through we know this, right, sort of mathematically, if I wanted a sample of Nevada, I would only have to ask about 5,000 people, and I could get a representation of the entire state. Now, obviously, there are a lot more than 5,000 people in the state, right? But as long as I ask people in Carson City and up north, right, and near the borders and near Kingman, right, and here in Vegas, as long as I ask everyone in these different regions proportionally, right, I would want more people from Vegas because there are more people from Vegas, I would get a representation of what Nevadans think about something, right? I could get a fair representation of it. And it would be fairly accurate, So how do I do this in a way to make sure that I'm not biasing myself, right? I don't want to ask, right, if you're saying, okay, I need to know about the next election. So I'm only going to ask students. Well, I shouldn't ask students, right? That's bad, right? Because students are more likely to be liberal. They're more likely to be, right, pro-Biden or pro sort of progressive agenda, right? Just by your youth, you're more likely to be Democrats. So if I only asked students, I'd be in trouble, right? It would not be an accurate sample. So how do I make sure that it's accurate, as accurate as possible? When we talk about the easiest way to do this is a random sample, a simple random sample. So I would just randomly pick people from the state of Nevada, and as I randomly pick them, because of the laws of probability, eventually I would get to a sample that represents the state, right? Eventually, right? If I picked enough people. The reason why this works is if, say, 20% of people in the state of Nevada are libertarian, then I have a 20% chance each time I randomly grab someone of them being libertarian, right? So because each group is a portion of the percentage, that's also the percentage chance I have of pulling from those people. So if I do it over and over and over again, eventually what I will have is the chance of grabbing those people is equal to their representation in the state, right? Hopefully that's clear, right? That randomness allows the probabilities to sort of push the representation of the population, right? If we are in Utah, which Utah is like 90%, not 90%, but overwhelmingly Mormon, white, sort of more conservative, then I were to randomly do that, I should come with a much more conservative picture than if I did a random sampling of Nevada, because Nevada, by population, is a little more liberal, a little more democratic, and much more diverse, right? So that's how we do that. Now, problematic, right? If you could get a random sample that's wrong, the random sampling is the easiest way to try and match the probability of the population being that set up. The way we used to do this before cell phones, what was called random digit dialing. So it's actually illegal in most states now, but you would dial a random phone number, right? Maybe I just want to talk to people in the 702 area code. So I just put 702 and then the random phone number that I get, and then I call someone randomly, right? That way I don't know who it is. I don't know the number, right? I record it, obviously, but that gives me a randomness that tries to match the sample to the population. Now, obviously this isn't as effective because one, very few people have landlines anymore, but two, we know that if you're under 25, you don't answer your phone, right? I'm sure all of your parents have made this complaint to you. My parents made this complaint to me, right? That we have the luxury that if we get a phone call now and we see some sort of phone number come up we don't know, we're like, no, I'm not dealing with that. So there's a bias there that older people, when they see a phone number they don't know, they will answer the phone and see who it is, right? Which is something that, I mean, maybe it's a generational shift, right? But millennials did not, right? If they don't recognize a phone number, I have this technology that makes it where I don't answer phone calls unless I know who it is, so I don't answer, right? Or why are you calling me when you can text, right? It's a generational shift. So random digit dialing doesn't work as much anymore, but you still need to get a large enough sample. So how do you get these people involved? If you don't get them, then it's called a sampling error. A sampling error simply means you didn't get enough people, right? And I want to be very clear about this because I'm almost positive this is going to be one of these is going to be a test question, right? What are the errors that exist? If your sample size is too small, it's called a sampling error, right? One of these, because we're going to talk about a few errors in the next one. Sampling error, if you only ask 8 people, that's not a representation of Nevada, right? You didn't ask enough people. So that's a sampling error. Sampling error is that the sample size is too small. Okay. So now we've talked about, okay, you're going to do a poll and you're surveying these people and you're trying to find their opinion. So you need a large enough group. You want to select people randomly so that they match the population, right? So now I ask 10,000 people. That's enough people, right? You actually don't need more than like 5,400. The way the math works, right? Eventually you get closer and closer to accuracy. You don't need to ask the whole population, right? It doesn't help. It doesn't help that much. So your sample's big enough. You're randomly selecting these people. So you don't have a sample problem. Now do you have a problem with your wording? So when we're asking questions, we have to worry about a lot of things. When we're doing an internet survey, we want to make sure that people are actually reading the questions, right? Amazon, it's called Amazon MTurk, and the surveys are up. or sometimes called SurveyMonkey or something like that. So if you go on an internet survey, the concern is not whether or not you are being biased, but whether or not you read the question at all, right? There's a lot of checks and balances in surveys like this because a lot of people get paid like $1.50 per survey. If you do enough surveys, it can add up to a significant amount of money, right? But you want to do them as quickly as possible. If I'm paying you to do surveys, you want to get through them as fast as possible because it's not hourly, it's per survey, right? You want to go as quickly as possible. So what you might do is not read the question or just figure out the fastest way to get through it to make sure you get your money, right? So internet surveys face this problem. A face-to-face survey faces a very different problem in what we call social desirability bias. And social desirability bias is that if I ask you a question and you think you know what the right answer is, or the answer that I want, you're going to give me the answer that I want and not the answer that is accurate to you. And the most obvious example that they do is if I were to ask a bunch of white males questions about race, and a gentleman who was black, or especially a black female, would ask a bunch of questions about race, that individual would give us different answers. Social desirability bias fits in that way, right? If you're speaking to a minority about immigration and you are a very conservative white person, your response is going to change because you're talking to someone and you know that that person's views are going to be different than yours, right? Why is it that we can't ask someone if they're racist in a survey? Because everyone would say no. Social desirability bias says that everyone, if they know what the socially acceptable answer is, they will give you the socially acceptable answer, right? So you can't ask someone if they're racist. The best thing that you can do is ask them a bunch of questions to see if they align with the sort of bigotry that belongs in racism, right? Because we want to know, right? If you're a researcher, you might want to know how much racism is in a society, but no one's going to overtly tell you that they're racist or that they have racist beliefs. You have to find different ways to do it, right? And in a face-to-face interaction, it's much more likely that you're going to get a biased answer. We have this issue whenever you see someone doing like surveying, and it won't happen the next few years, but if someone were to come up to you and ask you questions, one of the things that we know, right, if you want a higher response rate is you need more attractive surveyors, right? If you have very attractive people doing the surveys, people asking the questions, people will answer the questions. But the problem, right, why don't we just hire models and then everyone will be willing to talk to them and exchange, right, and give out their information? The problem is if you have someone who's very attractive doing the surveys, the other person is just trying to give them whatever answer they think will get them more time or an ability to date them, right? Especially college students, right? It used to be a practice that you'd want to hire like a bunch of really attractive college students to do surveys at colleges. Well, what happens is those other college students, the ones being asked the questions, are trying to figure out what the other person wants so they can get their phone number, right? Nothing immoral or tragic or anything like that, but the answers are wrong. They're inaccurate, right? We're not getting the actual person's preferences and values and beliefs. We're just getting what they think the other person's belief is, right? It's a mirroring problem. So selection bias always fits into that, or our social desirability bias always fits into that, right? Social desirability bias is problematic for all questions in political science because everyone thinks what the socially acceptable answer is, and it's very difficult for you not to get the socially acceptable answer, right? If I ask all of you about, police reform, especially on a college campus, all of you would be for police reform or for changing the funding for police or new rules, right? All of you would say a thing, but it's false consensus. You would all say it in a university. Most of you do not, a percentage of you don't believe that, but you know what the right answer in this classroom is, right? I'm a vegan. So if I ask you a question about meat eating, you're going to give me an answer that's different because you know who I am, right? That's social desirability bias. But in all of those things, the information is inaccurate. And as a scientist, I don't want information to be inaccurate. I want the accurate information, and so we have to watch out for this. And why am I spending so much time on this? This is the most common bias. This is the one that's hardest to get over, right? People didn't want to say they were voting for Trump in 2016, and then all of us, right, all the people doing that research were wrong about the outcome of the election, right? You need accurate information as a political scientist. The next part is selection bias, right? Selection bias isn't about the questions. It's about when you're picking these people, you are, right, picking a non-representative sample. We know that Latinx and Black individuals are much less likely to engage in a poll. So what you do is you run almost a quota system. And so if you're a surveyor and you are supposed to survey 100 people, and let's just say that the Nevada community is 11% Black, you have to get 11 Black people to answer your survey. So if you are on the street and you're trying to approach people, you're going to start approaching as many Black people as you can because you're trying to get them as a representative sample, right? But if you don't actively try and get those minority populations in, then you're going to have selection bias because you only talked to people that are answer your question. We see this with white surveyors. White surveyors are more comfortable only talking to other whites. And so you don't get a representative sample because their selection bias, their internal selection bias is that they will talk to more white people, and then they only have the representation of what whites in that area, in that area think, which is not representative of the entire population. We used to have this problem, not much anymore. There used to be this perception that females were much more likely to talk to other females, right? That if you're a female surveyor, that you're much more likely to talk to other females, and then you're not getting like a 50-50 split in representation. What we actually found in the research eventually was that that's not true at all. Is that females are just more likely to answer survey responses because they're socially conditioned to stop and be polite and answer questions, right? That especially in the 1980s, 1990s, going to 2000s, all of you, right, are conditioned in a specific way. And unfortunately, females are still socially conditioned to be receptive to answering questions, to be more polite, to be more apologetic, right? We know these things still exist, right? That if you ask males and females, you're going to get much more in detailed response from those females. And those females are going to be more willing to spend their time to answer those questions until they have children. As soon as they have children, they have no time, right? Because females are primary caregivers for children, much more likely than primary caregivers, then all of a sudden you can't talk to them. So if you want to talk to young mothers who have young children, that's a nightmare. But if you want to talk to females in general, right, they're much more likely to respond to a survey questionnaire, right, at younger ages. And as soon as people get older, anyone over 45 will tell you their opinion regardless of what you talk to them, right? That at some point, everyone wants to share their opinion. But then with young people, males are very difficult to get answers from. Okay, perfect. We'll talk about, if anything, I missed anything. I'm going over a little bit. And I think I was a few minutes late. I don't know, at some point we'll have a day where I'm going to be coming in late, but I'll let you know. And then we'll leave early Thursday. We'll leave like at 3:30 on Thursday. Just trying to balance out. So I'm keeping you longer than I would like. You guys are free to go though.